Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today in Politics on Trial, the first of 3 episodes about 3 epic trials that shaped American history. Today, I'm talking to a guest, to PPF regular Gary Gerstle, about the treason trial in 1807 of Aaron Burr, the man who shot Hamilton, former US Vice President. But in this trial, he was accused of wanting to set himself up as President of Mexico, King of Mexico, Emperor of Mexico, and invade the United States. Was that really what Burr was doing? And if he wasn't, what were they charging him with? Gary, we're talking about Aaron Burr, one of the most notorious figures in American history. We're going to be talking about a specific event, a trial. But before we get there and the events that led up to that trial, let's just say a bit about Burr himself, because he's a remarkable figure. What we're going to be talking about today is only a very small part of his life and career. But I think he has probably, and we'll get on to the main reason for this, gone down in history as a bit of a rogue, basically, among the founders, and he was one of the founders. He's the wrong un, as we say in Britain. Do you think of him as a rogue?
I think rogue is too strong a term. He clearly had an eye and a desire for intrigue, and he got himself into too many difficult situations to just attribute it to good intentions having gone awry or bad luck. So a bit of the rogue in him, but I object to too quick a characterization of him, as one of his biographers has titled her book Fallen Founder. He was a fallen founder. But a good deal of the calumny that has been imposed on him, I think, is calumny and not deserved. And I think he needs to be recovered from that state and understood in the fullness of his life. He's an extraordinarily interesting figure, and his downfall has as much to do with politics in the early republic and also his lack of a power base, either a family power base or a secure political power base. And one of the reasons he was involved in as many intrigues as he was involved in is because he did not have the resources that other founders had. If you think of George Washington, or if you think of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, these were wealthy men with long lineages of support, resources, allies. Burr did not come from wealth. He came from a distinguished intellectual religious family. His grandfather was Jonathan Edwards, one of the most distinguished preachers in America in the 18th century. His father was president of Princeton, then called College of New Jersey. So he had intellectual power and resources manifest clearly in his own intelligence across his life. But his parents both died when he was 2. He was orphaned. He had a pretty good situation given that he was an orphan. But he was not wealthy. He had a scrap for everything he gained in life. The most interesting person to compare him to is Alexander Hamilton, who was similarly an orphan and came from even less than Burr came from. Hamilton had a single-mindedness about him about how to achieve and maintain power that Burr evidently did not. They're very similar in terms of being outsiders, and they were always conscious of their outsiderness in this new republic, which for most of their lifetimes was still being run by an elite, aristocratic, gentrified. Hamilton cast his lot with the gentry and with the aristocrats, understanding that he had to be securely allied with some of them if he was to survive. Burr was the freer spirit, less certain of the value of those alliances, and also at a much earlier time developed what we might call a genuinely plebeian style of politics. He was going door to door. He was a popular figure. He was a man of the people in a way that Hamilton never was, or that none of the other founding fathers were. And so he was attracted to, there's a fierce streak of independence in him. He was a free thinker. He also, in terms of sexual politics, was a bit of a libertine. but not as he was often accused of being someone who was a predator, which became part of his reputation and part of the dimness of his reputation. He was someone who wanted to live freely and experimentally at a time when that was still looked down upon by the leaders of this republic, who believed that for this young republic to succeed, as much as it was meant to be different from European monarchies, there was still the conviction among many of the founders that it had to be led by men of wealth, talent, probity, virtue. And Burr just did not think in those terms. And we might imagine him as a man ahead of his time in that way, in terms of developing a plebeian form of politics that I would say the young republic was really not ready for.
Anyone who's seen Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton will know that before Burr and Hamilton became mortal enemies, in that telling, the first person that Hamilton goes to more or less say, how do I make it from nowhere, is Burr. They see a reflection of each other in the other one. Anyone who's seen Hamilton will also know that Burr came very close to being president. I mean, it's not completely clear how close. I mean, if you do it by the numbers, very, very close after the election of 1800. And in the Lin-Manuel Miranda telling, Hamilton throws the election eventually to Jefferson. It wasn't quite as simple as that. But Burr did come close to being president, and he ended up as vice president. It's one of those impossible counterfactuals. But do you think if Burr, not Jefferson, had become president in 1800, it would have been a different country? Or it would have at least shifted the United States onto a slightly different path that might have played out in a different way?
A really interesting question. He and Jefferson, it should be said, were ideologically allied in 1800. And the most significant fact of that election was that both of them were the top vote getters. And they were associated with a political party, or a proto-political party, that became known as Democratic Republicans. And they had a very different vision of the country than the Federalists like Hamilton or George Washington had. Hamilton and George Washington imagined a republic that would be aristocratic in its inclinations, that would follow a British model of economic development, heavily focused on manufacturing, cultivating commercial elites that could straddle the world with their trade. They both imagined a place for gentry in America for a long period of time. The Democratic Republicans ideologically were quite different. They imagined the core of America not being its urban space, its manufacturers, its international trade. The core was the independent farmer who owned his own tools, or an urban artisan who owned his own workshop, fully independent, dependent on nobody. This was seen as being the repository of Republican virtue and the guarantor of small r Republican liberty. They imagined a republic that had to be immense in terms of its land, because there had to be land for everyone, or at least all white settlers in America, because that degree of independence would sustain in America in a different way. So the allegiance and the convergence of Burr's thinking and Jefferson's thinking was significant, and in that respect, their visions of a future of America were allied. However, Burr was a Northerner, not a Southerner. He did own a couple slaves, but he was not part of the plantation gentry. He was not committed to an America in which slavery in the Southern states would be central to the future of America. And I think he also would have accelerated a process that in America takes off much later under Jackson and Martin Van Buren, a plebeian style of politics that challenged the power of the elites in a way in which the Jeffersonians, or the people around Jefferson, were never prepared to do. So I think he would have accelerated the plebeian style of American politics, which came later. It would have come anyway, so it wouldn't have been a drastic turn. One of the key questions in the counterfactual is whether he would have bought the gigantic Louisiana Territory in 1803, which arguably was Jefferson's greatest achievement and also the greatest risk. Would Burr have undertaken a similar project? Was he as committed to the rural vision of Jefferson, for which Louisiana was essential. It was also a continentalist dream of an empire of liberty stretching from coast to coast. Would Burr have been as committed to that, or would he have seen the future of America more in terms of what New York or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts were becoming, more urban? Would his focus have been more on artisans in urban areas rather than farmers in the countryside? So if he had declined to purchase Louisiana, and that was a big risk on Jefferson's part, then yes, the future of America would have been very, very different. And absent Louisiana, there would not have been the temptation for him to engage in the kind of intrigue that ultimately.
Exactly. I was going to say not only would America have been different, but well, we're already in the counterfactual, but we wouldn't be talking about his trial. The fact that we are talking about the trial about, I imagine most people would think, oh, so we're talking about the trial of Aaron Burr. He was vice president, but what we all know about him is that he shot Hamilton and killed him in a duel. So we must be talking about his trial for killing Alexander Hamilton. No, we're not, because we're talking about a different trial, but also there was no trial for Burr for killing Alexander Hamilton for a range of reasons, not least of which people made sure these duels happened across the river, right, in Jersey. So, state jurisdictions really, really matter in this context. As long as he didn't go back to Jersey, he was going to be okay. But it's not just that. He did lay low for a while after killing Alexander Hamilton. But then he came back and he resumed the office of vice president. Is it too anachronistic of me to be a bit shocked by that? That you could kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel and let the dust settle and then continue in the office of vice president?
I think you are being too anachronistic to think that that was an outrageous act. I don't think it was regarded as outrageous at the time. A bit of background, perhaps, on why the duel occurred. Even though Burr and Jefferson were allies, they didn't like each other. Jefferson feared Burr and his power, his plebeian style of politics, and had already decided that Burr would not be his vice president when he ran for re-election in 1804. Burr reads the handwriting on the wall. He needs to engage in a different future. He resolves to run for governor of New York, but the powers in New York are, on the one hand, Hamilton's Federalists, and on the other hand, DeWitt Clinton is a supporter of Jefferson, but an opponent of Burr. He controls the Democratic Republican machine in New York. And between Hamilton and DeWitt Clinton, they kill Burr's chances of winning the governorship. He loses by a very wide margin, and he is subject to relentless attack on his both political and personal reputation, relentless from all sides. And at one point, Hamilton calls his character despicable. And here, this is where we have to be careful about anachronism. This was a time of quite vicious political attacks. It was not a tame moment at all in terms of how these opponents treated each other. But the word despicable was considered to be beyond the pale because you were not attacking someone for their political views, you were attacking them for their character. And Burr takes deep offense. He demands an apology from Hamilton, expects to receive one because Hamilton had apologized a couple times in the past. Hamilton refuses to apologize, and when he refuses to apologize, that becomes the occasion for what has to be a duel, because if you were a gentleman at that time and if you demanded apology and did not receive one, you had to go to the next stage. But even when they went to the duel, it was not clear that the two men would shoot at each other. Maybe they would shoot to miss. Maybe they would just perform, go through the theatrics. And this is not what happened. Burr was understood to be within his rights as a gentleman. And because they went to New Jersey, where dueling was legal, unlike New York State, he could not be prosecuted on that ground.
Oh, so in fact, even if he'd gone back to Jersey, he'd have been okay because in Jersey it was legal. Right. So in fact, they couldn't get him anywhere.
There was talk of arresting him, but they couldn't get him anywhere. And this did harm his reputation very seriously, and it ends his career and his possibilities in national politics, at least in the East. And public opinion turned very sharply against him. How could one founder shoot another founder? This had never happened before. And so Burr suffered in the court of public opinion, but there was no legal reason why he couldn't resume his seat. And there are even some accounts when he goes to preside over the impeachment trial of a Supreme Court justice named Samuel Chase. There are even some reports of some of his Democratic Republican supporters cheering him when he entered the chamber because he was still regarded as someone who was fit to rule. And by all accounts, he performed very well in his presiding role over the trial of Samuel Chase for impeachment. So that was not in itself very controversial. There was not tremendous outrage across the broadsheets of America. My God, how can this man be returning to Congress? How can he be fulfilling his role? But there was an understanding that there was no future for this man. So it was a kind of last lap. That's an anachronistic statement because there was no last lap of a motor vehicle in 1804 to 1805 that he could have taken. So this is a profound moment for Burr. His national career is over. He does still have some dignity, but he is left with the question of what is a young man whose political career in the East now lies in shambles, and he's not going to be vice president again. What is a young man to do?
And we're going to answer that question because on that question turns the trial which we are here to talk about in 1807. But just to go back to the fact that not only was he not charged, brought to a court of law for what he did to Alexander Hamilton, but he went back to the Senate and as vice president presided in the Senate over the impeachment of a Supreme Court Justice, Chase. And as you said, he was thought to have done that well. And actually that impeachment failed. Most impeachments do fail, turns out, at the federal level because the bar is high. And this was part of the ongoing battle between the Jefferson administration and the court, the view that the court needed to be reined in, essentially, by the executive, and that the party would be marshaled to impeach this justice. And it failed. And as a result of that failure, some of the independence of the court was established through that failed impeachment. And that did have a bearing on Burr's own trial, because Burr's own trial 2 years later was presided over by Chief Justice Marshall. And the ongoing battle between Jefferson and the court was part of the backdrop to Burr's trial. So we should bear that in mind too. This is not just an incidental event. It's actually quite significant in what was going to happen both to Burr and to Jefferson.
And there's one other element in this struggle between the judiciary and the executive and Congress, which has to be mentioned. And that is a very famous court case that John Marshall, head of the Supreme Court, hands down in 1803, Marbury versus Madison. Anyone who studies law in America will know about that case, has to know about that case. What's critical about that case is that it establishes the right of the Supreme Court to review any piece of legislation passed by Congress to make sure that it accords with the Constitution. This right of review by the court of legislation passed by Congress is not set forth clearly in this way in the Constitution itself. And so the court decision in 1803 is a shot by the Supreme Court controlled by Federalists across the bow of Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalists have lost power. They've lost the presidency. They've lost a good deal of support in Congress to the Democratic Republicans. Their last redoubt at this point is the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court is, under Marshall's leadership, establishing its influence and its right to curb what they see as potentially unacceptable, by which they mean unconstitutional, expansion of congressional and executive power. So that's step one. Step two is the impeachment trial of Samuel Chase, another Federalist judge who is seen as acting too outrageously and independently in terms of making decisions. And the third act in this early struggle between the presidency, the executive, and the judiciary is going to be the trial of Aaron Burr himself, over which John Marshall is presiding. And both Marshall and Jefferson understand the stakes of that struggle and understand that maneuvering before the trial is going to be critical for determining its outcome.
So we are going to, people listening think, when are they going to get to the trial? We're going to get to the trial. But first of all, we have to answer your question, which is, what is a young man to do when his career in national politics is over? Barack Obama's answer to that question is become a producer at Netflix and do the intrigue behind the scenes, carry on, but not as a visible figure pulling the strings. Burr's answer was to go west. And actually, Burr's answer depended on the Louisiana Purchase having taken place. And from 1805 to 1807, Burr went on a journey that ended 2 years later with him being arrested and charged with treason. Effectively, under the terms of the Constitution, that meant making war against the United States, and also with breaching the 1794 Neutrality Act, which said you may also not make war against a foreign power if the United States is not at war with that foreign power. So two things going on. He was both accused of making war against the United States and effectively taking war to the Spanish territories when the United States was not at war with Spain. But it all turned on what did happen between 1805 and 1807. What did he do on his travels? Now, is it possible briefly, and I know there's no definitive answer to this question, but is it possible very briefly to sketch out what did Burr do as he headed west and eventually towards New Orleans?
Well, there are three possibilities as to what he was up to. His future, we should say, is not the Obama's future. He's still a very young man. Burr is only 39 when he's tossed out of Eastern politics in the East. Now, 39 is older then than it is today, but he still thinks of himself as a young man. And also, he never got the prize that Obama got, right? He did not get the top prize in American politics. So, yes, throughout the 19th century, the answer to the question, what do you do, young man? Well, go west, young man. And there are three possibilities of things he was up to. And one is definite, one is almost assuredly definite. And the third is the one that is in most dispute. And the third one has to do with the treason accusation. One is you purchase land in the West and you become a plantation owner or a agriculturalist and you become wealthy. This is something that the founding fathers were engaging in continuously. I think George Washington claimed land from Virginia all the way through Ohio, hundreds of miles before Virginia finally relinquished that land and gave it to the federal government. As a founding father, you needed land, and this was in the traditional Roman conception of what made a great republican. You had to have large landed estates that were going to guarantee your independence from all tyranny for all time. He bought land, and he kept that in reserve as a cultivator, but of course, he had never cultivated anything, and so this was going to be a new venture for him. But he does purchase land, and there is land waiting for him out in the West, and this is one possibility. The second possibility is that he is interested in attacking Mexico, which belongs to Spain at this time. This may sound outlandish that a private citizen is thinking in the early 19th century of attacking another country or another empire, but it was not outlandish at all in the early 19th century. The shape of what became the United States is very uncertain in the early 19th century. And one of the biggest questions was, could a land of this size, with so few people and a relatively weak central government, could it work? And more people than not said, no, it could not work. And one of the futures for America that a lot of people are talking about is what became the future of Latin America. Multiple independent republics descended from one imperial ancestor. So there are many people thinking like Burr, well, I'm going to get part of Mexico and I'm going to make it a Republic of Texas. Or I'm going to get California and make it the Republic of California. And we're going to have multiple republics in North America, all descended from a single imperial British ancestor. And we are going to be in concert with each other. There are many, many people thinking in these terms. And what I mean by that is that it is not outlandish for someone like Burr to imagine this as a future, and that this future would ultimately redound to the greatness of the United States. Maybe Mexico would remain independent under his leadership, but maybe at some point in the future, as Texas was, it would be incorporated into America as a great state.
So not president of the United States, but maybe president of Texas.
President of Texas, or what became Texas.
Carve out a bit of Mexico, call it maybe not Texas, but Burtopia or something, and become president of that.
Become president of that. A lot of people are thinking in these terms, and Burr is distinguished more by his belief we could actually make this happen than by the simple thought of, well, we could do this. And this is further complicated by the fact that there are still three European empires milling around the southern border of the United States: Spain, Great Britain, France. The only country that one could say was securely at peace with the United States with France, because that was achieved through the sale of Louisiana and an understanding of what would flow from that, because Napoleon selling Louisiana was in effect saying to the United States, we are making peace with you. We no longer are interested in this land. But that's not true of Spain, and it's certainly not true of Great Britain. And there's going to be a general who is going to ride to fame and then the presidency against Spain and Britain on the southern border of the United States. About 10 years after this, a man by the name of Andrew Jackson, who is going to be lionized because of his exploits in expelling Spanish and British influence from the southern border of the United States. So is the U.S. at war with Spain or not? Is the U.S. at war with Britain or not? There's skirmishing going on. Formal war has not been declared. But these are circumstances in which you can imagine an intrepid entrepreneur of geopolitics saying, this is our chance. And whether he wanted to be a potentate and set himself up as a monarch in Mexico for all time, or whether he imagined this as ultimately redounding to the greater glory of the United States, as happened in the case of Andrew Jackson, it's hard to say. But this does not mark him as a treasonous figure. And the evidence suggests that his mobilization of arms, his desire to collect some arms, to collect a small private army, was so he could march against Mexico. And he had as an assistant and a collaborator no one less than the senior general of the U.S. Army, a man by the name of Wilkinson, who was also the first governor of the Louisiana Territory. This is the man that Burr is talking to, and they are enlisting together in this filibuster. Wilkinson will ultimately betray Burr. He gets scared and he turns state witness, but they are in a fruitful collaboration. And as long as they were focused on filibustering, this was the term that was used, to raise a private army to go into another empire's territory was known as a filibuster. As long as they were focused on that, this was not considered to be a treasonous act. They could be judged to have violated the Neutrality Act, but that was an act of high misdemeanor. This was not an act of treason.
But there's the third possibility, which is the war was actually to be directed against the United States itself.
The third possibility was that he desired, as part of this filibuster, to peel off several southwestern states to join him in this venture. This would have been Louisiana, or what would become Louisiana. It would have involved Alabama, Mississippi. If this was part of the design, this would have been treason. This would have been an act of war against the United States as it was constituted. And this is the charge that is brought to him. This is the major charge at his trial.
And it's the thing that when Jefferson heard wind of this, he suspected was going on, or at least he contrived to suspect it was going on. Maybe he didn't, but it was convenient for him to believe that this was what was happening. Jefferson was apprised of what Burr was up to, and this played out over a couple of years. Rumors flew back and forth and letters flew back and forth, but over time, do you think Jefferson genuinely believed that this man was preparing to wage war against the United States, or that he found it convenient to believe that?
I think it was both. It's impossible to know what Jefferson was thinking in the innermost recesses of his mind. He feared not just that Burr might be engaged in a conspiracy to peel off several of the southwestern states, but I think he also feared that Burr might be successful as a filibusterer in Mexico, and that he would then be able to claim a large part of the Louisiana Territory from the United States. So I think he feared the filibuster on its own terms, but he was also aware that if this was just a filibuster, the only charge against Burr was that of a high misdemeanor, violating the Neutrality Act, and that would not put Burr out of business for the long term. Treason would put Burr out of business for the long term, and he went for treason. And he was an active instigator of this, and he was not simply someone sitting on high in a peaceful spot in Washington, D.C. or in Williamsburg thinking through these things intellectually. This was a period in which the press in the United States was highly partisan. The Jefferson press was highly partisan. Jefferson was a man of literature. He was a man of the written word. He was actively involved in spreading constantly the most scurrilous stories about Burr that were imaginable. So he was an active participant in this effort to convince the general public that Burr, this figure who was always a figure of intrigue and around which suspicion gathered, was up to the worst possible actions in the Southwest, and that was to break up the United States, not simply to claim Mexico either for himself or for the United States.
As with all trials, it's a pretty complicated event. There is a lot of paperwork that comes out of it. I've tried to read some of the transcripts and other things. It's easy to get lost in the weeds of this, but it seems to me like two or three big questions arose in the course of this trial. So one, and this was what most of the argument in the courtroom was about, concerns how to define treason. And in many ways, Burr's defense, which it's sort of in keeping with how people might think about this when they hear about it. When you talk about taking war to the Spanish, carving off part of Mexico, carving off southern states, you imagine some grand enterprise, don't you need a big army for that? And Burr's line was, well, that wasn't what I was up to. At one point in the trial, he said, this boat that was meant to be carrying military equipment downriver so I could take New Orleans, it just had a few sort of agricultural tools on it. I was a humble farmer going out there. Where and when was I gathering an army? Where was this army? When did this army raise its banner? When did this army make clear it was marching out to war? And this was one of the questions in the trial. Could Burr be placed somewhere where you could say an event was taking place, Burr was at the head of it, he was clearly physically present, that looks like an act of war? And it was very hard to make that case. So the case had to be extended to a kind of conspiracy. If some of these things were taking place, it was clearly under Burr's instigation, with his connivance. Even if he wasn't there, he'd communicated with these people and so on and so forth. And it became an argument about, is it possible to commit treason, that is, to wage war against the United States, merely by being part of a group of people who might be thinking about it? I mean, that's in a way the way that the trial boiled down on the charge of treason. And it's one of the reasons why he got off, because it's much harder to make that case.
Well, John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the person presiding at this trial, in some ways settles the outcome of the trial before it begins. He made it clear that treason against the United States had to be an overt act of war witnessed by two citizens who could be called into court to attest to this. This was a reading of the treason clause in the Constitution, but he did not have to define treason as narrowly as he did. There is wiggle room, as there is in most clauses of the Constitution. He might have left open a more expansive reading of what constituted treason, and he did not. And the fact that he did not perhaps has to be understood in the ongoing struggle between Jefferson and Marshall over the respective power of the court and the respective power of the presidency. And also, Marshall and Jefferson loathed and hated each other, and they were not going to aid each other in any way that they could avoid. It's not as though Marshall was a buddy of Burr, but sometimes the enemy of my enemy can be my friend. So this is a power struggle going on. Jefferson had put all his cards on the table before the trial had begun. Marshall, in fact, may have been angered by the fact that Jefferson was doing as much as he was doing to color the outcome of the trial, and one of his responses may have been to narrow the terms of treason so as to make it more difficult to convict him. In other words, part of what is fueling this battle is perhaps Marshall's conviction that Jefferson had already been acting beyond his role as president, that as president and as the chief officer of the United States, he should have sat back and let the judiciary do their work. So part of what's going on here is Marshall himself saying we are going to assert the prerogative of the court to define what is in the Constitution, and it's by those terms that Burr's innocence or guilt shall be determined.
But it's interesting that there were principled arguments as well as political arguments going on here. One of Burr's lawyers, the wonderfully named Luther Martin, not Martin Luther, but Luther Martin, made the case that the United States of America had broken free from the mother country, in part to free itself from some of those traditions, one of which was, under a monarchy, treason was very expansively defined, and it included not just plotting for the death of the monarch, never mind actually acting on that, but merely comprising it or imagining the death of the king or queen was treason in England, and cruel and unusual punishments followed from that. So if we are going to be a new republic, if we are going to be America, we can't have a broad and expansive notion of treason, because that makes us like those European monarchies, which are paranoid about threats to the king. And though Marshall, in his account, goes out of his way to say, we are in the common law tradition, we haven't broken free from the common law tradition. We have to take very seriously the arguments of English lawyers about these questions. But nonetheless, he comes to the same conclusion, which is our Constitution needs to narrow the definition of treason, not broaden it in that monarchical European style. And the argument was also made that if it includes these conspiracies rather than overt acts witnessed by two citizens, it suddenly expands. Someone could be 2,000 miles away, but might still be part of the conspiracy. We want them on the spot. So the narrowing of the definition was partly also to describe a version of what the United States is, which is weirdly non-paranoid. The paranoid styles, it's there and it's always going to be there. But this is a way of saying treason is one of the ways in which you can really allow for a broad account of the threats to the republic, and we need to narrow it down. It's actually quite a persuasive argument.
I would agree. I would agree with that. And certainly there is an effort on the part of Marshall and Burr's lawyers to use this as an occasion to distinguish America from Britain. And one of the strongest and most compelling points is if you thought ill of a king, or if you imagine that you might kill a king in the solitude of your home or your bedroom by English common law, that could be interpreted as being tantamount to treason. That is not the standard that we will be using here. People have to be freer to discuss and express their views. We need a tighter definition of treason. But the line that Marshall drew at this time is going to be hard for the courts to sustain across the rest of American history. Here I jump forward to anarchists on trial in the 1880s or communists on trial during the McCarthy period in the late 40s and early 50s. And here the courts are coming to different conclusions.
I'm going to come to the Haymarket trial in this series. So we will indeed be talking about that. It's one of the things that makes the Burr trial so interesting, that attempt to hold that line. The battle between Marshall and Jefferson also played out before the trial started over what could be called in evidence, because Burr and his lawyers wanted the letters between Jefferson and Wilkinson to be made available to the court, and Jefferson said there was executive privilege. How did that fight play out?
Marshall takes an expansive view of the rights of an accused person to have full access to evidence that might either be incriminating or exonerating. And so he rules that the correspondence of Jefferson pertinent to the Burr case, which was voluminous, has to be turned over to Burr and his attorneys and can be introduced as evidence in court. And this is a clear infringement on the part of the judiciary asserting its independence to rule on questions of executive privilege. And here, this is a clear effort by the court to narrow the scope of executive privilege and to say that in a case of this sort, where so much is at stake, potentially a person's life, this evidence has to be turned over, and Jefferson can't hide behind the veil of executive privilege and invoke executive privilege in regard to documents that may be crucial to proving guilt or innocence. The second half of this, however, is that Jefferson refuses to turn over the evidence so that the ruling goes into effect, but the evidence that the Burr attorneys are seeking never comes their way.
And going forward, was the precedent set here The one that Marshall set, which is we can demand this stuff, or the one that Jefferson set, which is you can demand it, but you ain't getting it. I mean, it was more the second than the first, wasn't it, in a sense? What had been shown was that a president could resist those demands.
Yes, but I think the question of executive privilege along these lines is not central to a lot of debates in the 19th century about presidential power versus judicial or congressional power. This is going to become an issue for the 20th century, and it's going to come into very sharp relief in relation to questions of war and America entering the period when it's at war or at near war on a almost a full-time basis, a period of American history that begins in 1941 and really has not ended. It's in that period that questions of executive privilege, where one can invoke the war as a justification for privilege and guarding the national security of the United States. It's in relation to that period of American history where the question of executive privilege is going to become very, very urgent. So even though this is an early demonstration of a battle over the boundaries of executive privilege, it's not going to have a huge influence on jurisprudence in America for much of the 19th century. What is far more important in this way is the larger battle of which it is part, which is who rules, the executive or the judiciary. And I would say this round of that battle goes to the judiciary. And I think the judiciary has established its right of judicial review, which is going to continue to gain strength across the 19th century. And the circumstances that are going to reverse that are going to have a lot to do with questions of war and national security. First, the Civil War, and then the World Wars and Cold War of the 20th century.
So in that respect, Burr is just a pawn in a much bigger game. I mean, they wanted to make him the villain of the piece, but as described there, it sounds a bit like this wasn't about Burr personally at all, though Jefferson had come by this point to loathe him. The two people who were fighting this out were Jefferson and Marshall, and Burr was, the shuttlecock they were playing with.
Yes, and this is a moment where America is still a very new nation, a very young republic, having put into place a very different kind of system of governance from that which it inherited from the English. And there are some moments, especially around the July 4th holiday, where the founding fathers of the United States are lauded for having this extraordinary and fully formed blueprint of what a republic might look like and how the liberty of individuals might be protected, and while allowing for the integrity of a nation to solidify and gain in esteem. And what this episode about Burr reveals is in these early decades of the republic, no one is sure where the boundaries of power lie. And if we reflect on that, that makes sense, right? If you're inventing a new system of government and the only examples you have for how that government functions successfully lie in the ancient world, you really are uncertain about the structures of government you are establishing. And it makes a great deal of intuitive sense that there are going to be struggles over power and defining where the boundaries of power lie and establishing or securing norms about where they should lie. So that Burr is a pawn is true, and there are power plays going on all around him. But in defense of the big power players, they understand that what's at stake is the success or failure of this new system of government. Just as there is no assurance that this United States will survive as the United States, as opposed to multiple independent republics descended from a common imperial ancestor, so too there's no assurance that the internal system of governance, the division of powers between the central government and the states, the distribution of power to three branches of the federal government, there's no assurance at this point that that system really is going to work. And so it's not just power players, it's an understanding that the future of the republic really is at stake. It was, and that's ultimately what people are fighting about in this trial.
Burr was acquitted of the charge of treason, partly, as you say, because John Marshall more or less made it impossible to convict him. Witnesses were called, the trial took place, and attempts were made to place him somewhere where people could say an army had gathered and there was clear witnessed intent. But those witnesses were often discredited. They contradicted each other. The stories were pretty flaky, to be honest. And the third reason that Burr got off is that they went for the treason charge, not the Neutrality Act charge. It would have been easier, and Marshall indicated this himself. He thought it should have been easier to convict Burr on the charge of taking the fight into Mexico rather than trying to capture New Orleans, which he wasn't going to be able to do with the ragtag army he hadn't even assembled yet. And the jury was sent out to consider their verdict. They came back and they gave the verdict not guilty. But it is very interesting, and there's a little description of it in the official transcript of the trial. They came back and they didn't say not guilty. It should just be 2 words, not guilty. We find the defendant not guilty. And they said, we find the defendant not guilty on the basis of what we've been told and the evidence that's been presented to us. They hedged it. They tried to say, we've more or less been told we have to find him not guilty, but we think something very, very dodgy was going on here. And Burr was furious and his lawyers were furious, and they halted proceedings, and they said the jury has to be sent out again and told to come back again and not deliver a verdict with caveats. Not guilty, so far as we can tell, on the basis of what we've been told and instructed, but not guilty. And the jury was split on that question. Some of them said, no, we don't want to say not guilty. We want to say, well, we have to say not guilty, but. And in the end, that fight had to be fought, and Burr won on that one too. And they eventually came back. We find the defendant not guilty. But it's indicative of the fact that it was, I think, widely believed that he got off on a technicality. And in the court of public opinion, he was damned by this. If he was finished before, he was super finished now, right? The American public, of course, a lot of them influenced by the Jeffersonian press, were having none of this. This man was an absolute renegade and a threat to the Republic. It is interesting, in the court of public opinion, though he won in the court of law, Burr lost this one.
Oh, he absolutely lost in the court of public opinion, and it ends his political career. He's got to live a long time after this, and he's got to make a living as a lawyer, and he's going to be involved in all kinds of small-scale intrigue from his base in New York after he returns from Europe. But he's never again going to be a figure to reckon with in American politics. And it's from this moment that he becomes the fallen founder, and it's from this moment that an odor attaches to him that never leaves him. But I actually don't think that he got off on a technicality, because I think the evidence that again, treason would have involved plans to peel off several Western states. I definitely think he was planning a filibuster into Mexico. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. But that was not treason. The treasonous part was whether there was an active plot. And let's put aside the question of an overt act. Let's put that aside. Was there evidence to suggest that he was involved in a campaign to peel off several states of the United States to join his new republic? And as I read the trial, the evidence of that does not surface. It is in the testimony of the general, Wilkinson, who testified against him but was thoroughly discredited. And then he was associated with this crazy man named Blennerhassett, who owned the island on which the ragtag army of Burr and the Ohio River was hoping to assemble, going down the Ohio River and then down the Mississippi River. And he was an Anglo-Irish aristocrat with very large and crazy dreams of all kinds of escapades. And he had published a couple articles in which he was imagining that he might take a state or two of the southwestern United States and incorporate them into a different republic. Burr was in conversation with him. He was hosting Burr on his island. This was the site where Burr was assembling something. But even here, I think the evidence was not strong enough to indicate that Burr was actively engaged in a conspiracy to break up the United States as it was constituted. So I think it's not fair, and here I'm doing a bit of reclamation for Burr's reputation, not fair to say he got off on a technicality. I think it is fair to say that exactly what he was doing in the West in terms of the filibuster never became sufficiently clear. So it remains shrouded in mystery and intrigue. But your point that this is the end of Burr as a significant political figure is absolutely true. In the court of public opinion, he was convicted. There was widespread belief that he was hiding things that, if they came to light, might reveal that he was engaged in treasonous acts. But I think this has as much to do with the success of Jefferson's campaign against him in the court of public opinion. And this was a moment where the Jeffersonians were becoming much more skilled than the Federalists at courting public opinion. They are on their way to becoming the dominant political party in America for the next 30 years. This is their moment of triumph in a way. And what we are getting is the Democratic Republican version of Burr's guilt. And Jefferson is successful at crushing a man who he deeply, deeply feared as a political rival.
I also don't think he got off on a technicality. What's interesting is the jury wanted to convey their sense that something was hidden and hadn't been revealed. In a way, what the jury wanted to do, if they'd been allowed to do, was that third verdict that's allowed in Scottish law of not proven. That's what they wanted to say. They didn't want to say not guilty. So maybe technicality is putting it too strong, but they wanted to say not guilty of this, but definitely guilty of something. And in a way, as you suggested, they were probably right. But of course, a court of law is a court of law. It's no good to say, okay, yeah, we didn't make it on this thing. Can we run that trial again and try something else? They could have tried something else. They could have tried the Neutrality Act. They didn't. They went for this. They did destroy him in the process. So maybe job done, Jefferson would think. Jefferson had a pretty hairy ride during that trial, not least because he was taking on Marshall. But at the end of it, his rival Burr was finished. But he was absolutely acquitted by law, as he should have been. I've read the whole of Marshall's, it's very lengthy, the whole of Marshall's guidance to the jury, and it's pretty persuasive, I think. But at the same time, the jury wanted to say, yes, Your Honour, but. And Burr knew what they were about. He insisted on his rights, not guilty. He got his rights in the court of law, and public opinion destroyed him. Next time in Politics on Trial, I'm going to be talking about another epic American trial. This one is the trial of John Brown for his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. He wanted to end slavery in America. He didn't succeed, at least not directly, but indirectly, he helped start a civil war. It's also a trial that gave rise to some of the greatest speeches in American political history. I would say some of the greatest speeches in the English language. Join us to find out what they are. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.